second one is going to take place on March 24th, 3 weeks from now, and it's going to focus on one of the major determinants of daily life in the Middle East, polarization, and one of its main determinants, ethnic conflict, which has always been an issue, not only in the Middle East, but maybe in Turkey as well. That public lecture is going to be given by Deborah Ray of New York University, who is one of the top development economists in the world. But today, the stage is Professor Timur Kuran's. Timur Kuran is a professor of economics and political science at Duke University. He is also holding the Gorter Family Professorship in Islamic Studies. He is one of the well-known experts in the area of the economics of the Middle East, and he has had countless contributions in other fields in social change. Ladies and gentlemen, it's my great pleasure and honor to present Professor Timur Kuran.
Thank you very much, Eren, for the introduction, and I'm delighted to be here. This is not my first time at Sabancı University. I have many friends on the faculty. I also should say that I have a special fondness for Tuzla. I came here first at age 9. My parents thought it would be a good idea for me to attend summer camp out here. At the time, I did not imagine that some 40 years later, I would be here speaking about one of the grand puzzles of the social sciences. So the puzzle is that the Middle East has had a poor economic record over the past 2 centuries. Now this is a puzzle because in the Middle Ages, the region was advanced by the standards of the day. Only China might have been richer, not by much. I'm using the term Middle East, by the way, in the broad sense to include not only the Arab world, but also Turkey, as well as the Balkans, which were under Ottoman rule for much of the second millennium. My goal is to offer an explanation for this turn in the region's global economic standing, and the thesis that I will develop is centered on the region's traditional economic institutions. By and large, these institutions were components of the law of the land, Islamic law, in other words, the Sharia in Turkish Shariat. In the pre-modern Middle East, not every aspect of daily life was governed by Islamic law, but critical aspects of the economy were, and that made a huge difference to the region's economic trajectory. So let's start by asking when the region started to look relatively poor. It is in the 18th century that knowledgeable people started treating the Ottoman Empire, the Arab world, and Iran as economically backward. By the 19th century, this perception was shared by peoples of the region, including Ottoman leaders. This period when the Middle East started looking obviously underdeveloped coincides with the Industrial Revolution. The new industries of the period involved mass production using new technologies. These technologies emerged in Western Europe. That part of the story is quite well known. Also critical, however, is that Western Europe took the lead in developing institutions that enable the exploitation of the technologies of mass production. By the late 18th century, through stock markets, banks, and corporations, Western Europe was mobilizing the savings of large numbers and channeling them into large projects involving mass production. Western entrepreneurs were pooling the labor and capital of large numbers within indefinitely living companies. Now, these are capabilities that we now take for granted, but they posed immense challenges, immense organizational challenges in some parts of the world, China, India, and certainly the Middle East. The new physical technologies were easily transferable. You can carry a steam engine like the one you see on the screen on a ship from one part of the world to another. If you don't know how to operate it, you can bring a technician you can import a technician to run it. The organizational means, in other words, the institutions that enabled the West to exploit the new physical technologies, these were not so easily transferable. You can't set up a stock market overnight. It requires an intricate legal system and various professions to support it and schools to train the professionals. As growth took off in the West, the Middle East could import the technologies of industrialization, but it lacked the organizational capabilities to use them. And these could not be borrowed at will or quickly. And that is one of the key reasons why the gap in living standards emerged in the first place and then widened. That organizational limitations posed a huge handicap was noticed by Ottoman and Egyptian leaders in the mid-19th centuries. In the Ottoman Empire, the response to this realization was the founding of the first completely indigenous modern company, a company intended to have an indefinite existence and to have publicly traded shares. This was the Şirket-i Hayriye Maritime Transportation Company. This company was meant to be a prototype of a completely new type of company, at least with respect to the traditional legal system of the Ottoman Empire. So a neologism was created to describe it. Even though the name Şirket was in the company's name, it was not founded as a Şirket in the traditional sense. Rather, it was established as a kumpaniye. Later that word became kumpanya, a kumpaniye that would operate outside of Islamic law, at least as Islamic law was understood at the time. The word, of course, the word kumpaniye was derived from the English company and the French compagnie. Şirket-i Hayriye issued 1,500 tradable shares, and most were bought at Abdülmecit's insistence. Most were bought by Muslim Turkish dignitaries. Sultan Abdülmecit served as the main shareholder, and he also became the company's patron. Now, why did the Sultan get involved? By the 1850s, the most dynamic sectors of the Ottoman economy were dominated by permanent and large enterprises. And these were all owned by foreigners, or in some cases, foreigners allied with local minorities. Abdülmecit felt that it was time for Muslim Turks, the politically dominant nation in the empire, to begin pooling capital within large and durable companies capable of exploiting modern technologies. And the political leadership, he thought, would set an example for the rest of society to follow. Evidently, Ottoman elites were coming to grips with the limitations of traditional economic institutions grounded in Islamic law. They recognized by then that traditional institutions for pooling capital and labor, commercial partnerships formed under Islamic law, and I will say more about them, and these were ill-suited to forming and running the sort of enterprise that prevailed in new sectors such as banking, mass transport, and mass manufacturing. In these modern sectors, enterprises did not consist of partnerships. And you could not compete with Europeans in these sectors through organizations that had not changed form in 1,000 years. In fact, the empire's Muslims could not compete through these traditional institutions with the local minorities, the Greeks, Armenians, and Jews, who were forming alliances with Europeans and benefiting from modern European institutions. Let me relate the leap that Abdülmecit tried to make to the three basic organizational forms used in commercial life. In the 1850s, the organizational menu in the Ottoman Empire and the rest of the Middle East was limited to various types of partnerships. These are enterprises established for specific purposes. Every member has veto power over decisions, and the shares are not tradable. Abdülmecit tried to broaden the menu of options by establishing Şirket-i Hayriye not as a partnership, but as a joint stock company. Shares would be tradable, so the enterprise would have a life independent of the lives of individual founders and employees. Now, most of the world's largest companies, even then, and certainly today, are corporations. Unlike a standard joint stock company of the kind that Abdülmecit used, a corporation has standing in court. It can sue and be sued as an organization. Şirket-i Hayriye was not a corporation. It has one feature of a corporation, but not all. Incorporation under Ottoman law, in other words, the act of establishing a corporation, became possible only in the early 20th century. That is when the first laws of corporations were passed in 1906, first in the Ottoman Empire, and a few years later in Egypt. Now, how successful was Abdülmecit's plan to trigger an explosion in large companies owned by Ottoman Muslims? In other words, how successful was Abdülmecit in inducing Muslims to start who operated under partnerships, who conducted commerce, formed companies for manufacturing using partnerships? How successful was he in getting people to establish joint stock companies? In the short term, he wasn't successful at all. It took 60 years for the initiative to bear fruit. Up to the early 20th century, almost all the new publicly traded companies in the Ottoman Empire were formed by foreigners and minorities. Only after 1906, when the Ottoman Empire instituted its first law of corporations, did the empire's Muslims start forming publicly traded, large and durable companies. Now, why did it take so long? In the 19th century, critical complementary institutions were missing. Now, before I identify what these critical institutions, the missing complementary institutions that prevented Abdülmecit's plan from bearing fruit for more than half a century, before I identify what these are, I would like to take you back 1,000 years and tell you about the legal system under which the private economy in the Middle East and the private economy in the Ottoman Empire traditionally operated and still operated for the most part at the time that Abdülmecit made this intervention by establishing Şirket-i Hayriye. In the Middle East, 1,000 years ago, commercial enterprises were formed under Islamic partnership law. This law enabled people to pool labor and capital in commercial enterprises. The emergence of this law was a very important development. People could always do business, even before Islam, using their own capital. They could form proprietary businesses. To do business on a larger scale, they needed to pool resources with others within partnerships. The first place they looked, of course, was the family, because family members tend to trust each other. But not everyone has a family able to supply capital. So every civilization, whether we're talking about China or Europe or Islamic civilization, every civilization has faced the challenge of promoting trust among non-relatives who stand to gain by pooling capital and labor. Specifically, you have merchants and producers who need capital to finance their ventures, and you have potential investors who cannot or simply don't want to do the physical work, like carrying goods to a distant land by joining a caravan. The challenge is to devise institutions that allow this pooling to take place across family lines. So Islam produced an impressive contract law for the period to regulate partnerships among these groups. The typical partnership, known as mudaraba, or in Turkish mudaribe, involved two people. It combined the labor of a producer or traveling merchant with the capital of a passive investor. In a commercial partnership, profit shares were set in advance. The merchant